Name is Fred. First name's Fred. Middle name P-A-U-L-D-E-E, Paul D. Dallas. I go by Paul, and I was in the Army, infantry, training in Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Sent me to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, down below Hattiesburg,
Okay.
100 miles from the farm where I grew up. That's where I took my training.
Okay. How long were you in training?
About 7 months.
Was there anything, what do you remember most about training?
Well, several things. Number one, it was real hot. I was in infantry training, actually in the 65th Division for training. And the training, basic training and unit training together lasted about between 6 and 7 months. And at the end of that training period, I was shipped to Fort Meade, Maryland.
Were you in Maryland very long?
3 weeks. 4 days of that 3 weeks, I was in Washington, D.C. I'd never been out of the state of Mississippi before, so I'd never been to Washington, D.C. before. And I talked a guy into getting 3-day pass and going with me. Well, we enjoyed it very much. It was a real education. Well, first of all the big buildings, I couldn't believe it. And we did get to, it was on the weekend, but we were able to visit we were not able to visit in the White House, but we were able to visit in the Senate office buildings and several different buildings. And then most of the other historical sites around Washington we were able to visit. We stayed busy, did a lot of walking, but did a lot of sightseeing also.
What was your mindset back then, waiting to be shipped out?
Well, I knew that we would be shipped out real soon after we returned to Fort Meade at the end of the 3 days. We were back in Fort Meade about 2 hours when I received orders to board a troop train the next morning for Camp Patrick Henry, Virginia. And we rode that train down to Camp Patrick Henry. We thought we were going to get off the train and go into the buildings at that camp. But orders came through for us to get off the train and walk straight to the ship.
So you went from the train right to your ship?
Right to the ship.
And where was the ship headed?
Well, we had no idea then where it was headed, but after 28 days on the ship, we finally landed in Naples, Italy.
Do you remember what Naples was like at the time? Was it war-torn?
Yes, it was war-torn, pretty much so.
What year was this?
This was in 1944.
Okay.
In fact, we landed in Naples July. I'm sorry, I'll change that. June 28th,
June 28th.
1944.
Okay. So were you thrown into combat right away?
No, we were put in a replacement camp in the Volturno River Valley. We said at that time it was the hottest place in the world. It was even hotter than Camp Shelby, Mississippi was. And we took some training while we were in this replacement camp. We also were able to get some 3-day passes and do some visiting in southern Italy. My cousin and I and I need to explain about my cousin in a moment. My cousin and I got a 3-day pass together and went to Naples, and went from Naples on a train up to Mount Vesuvius to city of Pompeii, and visited up there, and that was a real education for us. And then we rode the train back down the mountain to Naples, and started walking down the streets in Naples. We passed this family sitting out in front of their house having dinner outside. They invited us to have dinner with them. We were a little afraid to do that, but we appreciated it. We thought there was still some enemy still in and around Naples, and I think we were right. So we weren't real sure that the food was poisoned, something we didn't know about. Anyway, we spent the night in a USO. The next morning, we rode an Army bus back to the camp in the Volunteer River Valley. A couple of days later, I was assigned to the 45th Infantry Division, and my cousin, G.W. Dallas, was assigned to the 85th Division. If I may, let me explain how my cousin and I wound up together in Italy. When we boarded the ship in Newport News, Virginia, it was dark when we finished boarding the ship. Of course, there were 3,000 or 4,000 GIs that got on the ship late that day. We were standing up on the top deck against the rail, looking at Newport News, Virginia. Lights had come on, it was getting dark. And some guy standing next to me on my right, in fact, we were pushing shoulders against shoulders. We were so tight up there on this rail. This guy said, "Well, we'll probably never see this sight again." And I thought, gee, that guy sounds familiar. But I couldn't, it was dark, I couldn't see him or recognize him. So I said, "Would you repeat what you said?" So he repeated it. And I said, "G.W. Dallas, where did you come from?" That's when we got together on this ship after him being trained in Florida and me in Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Very odd coincidence. Well, I understood at that time there were more than 5,000 on there, but I think that must have been the total for the soldiers on the ship and the crew. Because I've read since then, in fact in the last couple of years, that there were 3,700 soldiers on the ship, and I've forgotten how many crew members. It was loaded anyway. The name of the ship was USS General Black. It had been converted to a troop ship. And the reason we stayed on the ship so long, German submarines were operating in the middle of the Atlantic. And the big convoy that we were in, the entire convoy started moving south in the Atlantic. I knew the direction in which we were going, and I kept asking around, why are we going south? We should have been going east. And finally, after several days, the convoy changed courses and started going east, and we came along the coast of South Africa, actually on the west coast of Africa, for several days. And the convoy finally stopped at Oran, Africa. I assume they stopped to unload something or to reload. take on additional troops, I don't know. But we stopped for a day and a night at Oran. And then the ship finally moved on around the coast of Africa through the Straits of Gibraltar and wound up in Naples, Italy. That was 28 days.
So I guess you've never been that far away from home before.
No, I'd never been that far away from home before. In fact, I'd never been more than 120 miles from home before. In August, on August 15th, on August 12th, we were ordered to board landing craft in the port at Naples. And these landing crafts went along with LSTs. I mean, the Mediterranean was covered up with LSTs and landing crafts.
What were LSTs?
That was smaller ships that moved divisions, regiments. They moved us up through the Mediterranean to Marseille, where we made the landing. But it took 3 days once we got aboard these landing crafts. It took 3 days before we made the invasion at Marseille.
So what was it like being part of an invasion?
Well, it wasn't as bad as I had thought it was going to be, because we learned when we got on the beach that the German army, that part of the German army, had moved out of Marseille mostly. They knew we were coming. And I think the German army moved a lot of them inland to help relieve the troops that invaded at Normandy and was going across France. But 2 days later, the German army hit us pretty hard.
Do you mind describing what that was like?
Well, first of all, my company, the F Company, rode a freight train, rode on boxcars for a few hours out of Marseille up into the countryside looking for the Germans, and we found them. We passed them, and when we got off the boxcars, they pinned us down with machine guns. And of course, it started getting kind of rough then. But before we did that, I need to say, riding those boxcars, we had the big doors open, and one of our buddies had built a fire in a coal heater on the boxcar. With those doors open, it was kind of cool and it was damp. And I was standing behind the heater with my hands up warming them. And for some reason, the train made a sudden stop. And the big door slammed closed. One soldier was standing in the door with his hand up in the door. It cut his hand off. It threw me against the heater, the top of the heater, with my right hand. And of course, it cooked the inside of my hand. After we got off the train, the medic put some medication on my hand, a bandage, told me to go to the aid station. I never went to the aid station. I didn't want to leave my squad. I, by the way, had been made squad leader on the beach after our squad leader was killed by a sniper. And so I stayed with the unit.
What happened to your union?
Pardon?
What happened to your unit?
Well, we we moved on inland and had quite a bit of fighting. We captured, I don't know how many, but we captured probably 60 or 70 German soldiers. And we lost a few men, but we kept moving. And actually we were in combat almost every day and every night for 3 months and 12 days.
What is that like? Can you talk about being in combat?
Well, in the beginning it was real scary, of course. We were trained for it, but it was still scary when you got machine guns shooting at you and burp guns. But we were lucky. We lost some men, but we got rid of a lot of the enemy also. My squad was ordered to go on reconnaissance patrol almost every day.
What is reconnaissance patrol?
Well, we went out locating the enemy and estimating how many was in the units, going back, reporting back to the commander. And some days I was ordered to go on combat patrols with my squad. And we got in some trouble doing that. For example, one day we were on this combat patrol in the mountains, and we were walking up the mountain where big trucks had been down the mountain when it was raining, and they had deep ruts. We were walking up these ruts up that mountain looking for the enemy when all of a sudden machine guns opened up on us. We hit the ground and actually crawled back down those ruts all the way to the bottom of the mountain. And I lost 2 guys out of the squad that day. But again, we were lucky.
I read in your bio that you were unfortunately captured yourself.
Yes, on November 28th, the regimental commander had sent orders up before daylight that morning for my unit to take 3 towns up in Alsace-Lorraine, part of France. We took all 3 towns by lunchtime. He sent additional orders up for us to move on into a town named Muhlberg. Well, it had been raining that morning. It was real muddy out in the field. We were wound up out in a big field looking down the hill at the town. But we were supposed to wait for a heavy artillery barrage to be laid on the town before we moved in. Well, our artillery barrage did not come. Instead, we saw German tanks coming out of the town. And I never know how many tanks there were, but there were a lot of them, probably 20 or 30. And of course they were the big Tiger tanks, had the 88 artillery guns on them, of course, plus the machine guns. And they laid a lot of rifle fire on us in the beginning. A machine gun shot my helmet off my head. I thought it broke my neck.
Wow.
Of course it didn't, but it felt like it did. And the tanks moved closer. Now, when you start shooting against a tank with an M1 rifle, it's about as effective as throwing peas against a wall. So we knew we had had it. but they moved closer, and one of the tanks, he rolled that 88 gun down. And by the way, we started digging trenches, something to get in to keep the tank from smashing us. Because I had seen enemy tanks smashed over our men before. I didn't want to be smashed like that, so boy, we dug. Me and my assistant squad leader. And we had it down deep enough we could kind of hide our bodies. And I'm looking up over the end of it, pile of mud in my face, and they fired that 88 gun pointing at us. Well, I'm here today, so you know it was a dud. But it hit up in front of us, probably 15 or 20 feet, kicked the mud up, and the shell went underneath us, and we knew it stopped under us because the mud we were laying in got hot, or it got warm. Well, they fired another one, and it was not a dud. It created a large crater in the ground like a 1,000-pound bomb going off. Covered us with mud, I guess, which was lucky, because neither one of us got any shrapnel wounds from but the concussion was terrible. For example, I might just say at this point, I had an expansion band wristwatch on my wrist. I don't know why I was wearing it in combat, but I was. The concussion was so bad. Later, I checked that watch, see why it wasn't running. Every wheel in the watch was out of place. That's how bad the concussion was.
Wow.
So you know what it would do to your brain. Anyway, pretty soon, a German officer came up out of the tank with a burp gun in his hand, pointing right at my face. I had my M1 rifle pointing at his face also. And he said in English, "Pull the trigger, you're dead anyway." Well, I cut my eyes around and saw several enemy guns pointing at my face. I knew if I pulled the trigger, I'd be dead and all my squad would be dead also. So I did what he said. He said, drop your weapons and put your hand up. That was our choice.
So where did they take you?
Well, they had us to get on German half tracks and took us downtown in Mulhouse. I guess it was going through the town with us. Our artillery barrage came at that point, and it was a tough one. It plastered the town.
So you were
we
hit
jumped,
by your own.
Yeah, we jumped off the tanks, jumped off of the half tracks, along with the Germans, trying to take cover from the artillery that was falling. I thought at that point that was a good time to escape. So I saw a concrete block wall, probably 20, 30 yards away. I took off running to that wall, laid down real close to the wall as protection from the flak. And by the time I laid down good, something started sticking my right shoulder. And I looked around, and a German soldier was standing there, standing straight up, flak flying everywhere, pushing me with his gun, with his bayonet, telling me, "Let's go." So I thought, man, you are a stupid guy. But I had no choice. We went. And at that time, when the barrage stopped, they put us on trucks, German army trucks. And they hauled us across the river to Strasbourg. They had an interrogation center set up in this building in Strasbourg. So we spent the night there that night, being interrogated most of the night, off and on.
What is it like to be interrogated?
Well, it was kind of tough because the interrogator was threatening you all the time. And they were firing guns behind the building to make you think they were killing the guy just ahead of you, so you never knew if they were or not. But it was a little scary. And I didn't know any answers to his questions. I either said, I don't know, or I gave him a name, rank, and serial number. Now, we had been trained in basic training what to do if we was ever captured. And that training only covered this. If you're ever captured, give your name, rank, and serial number. That's it. So that's what I was doing. And then I did a lot of I don't know.
Do you need to answer that?
She'll get it. And
I think she got it.
she got it.
Okay.
Anyway, being captured, something you never want to go through. But he finally, by the way, all the time here, he's doing the interrogation, this officer, he's got a German sergeant sitting over there next to you with a gun in your face. You know, if you answer wrong, he'll pull the trigger. Well, finally he told me, the officer told me, he said, "You're a liar. You've been lying to me tonight. I'll talk to you later," and told the German sergeant to take me back to the back. Well, a little while later, the German sergeant took me back up to the interrogation room. And the guy said to me then, "You're going to remember later lying to me tonight." He said, "But I'm going to inform you, I'm going to give you some information. Your mother maiden name was Threet." And that shocked me. How in the world did he know my mother's maiden name? You finished high school on a certain date. You were drafted on a certain date. You reported to Camp Shelby, Mississippi on a certain date. I mean, he knew my Army record up that far. Then I realized that they must have captured regimental headquarters, because that morning the company commander had told me, "By the way, your promotion to sergeant's going through today. I'll be signing your records today." I said, "Thank you," and went on about my business. All that beginning to add up. They had captured regimental headquarters because that guy knew something about what was in my records.
Must have been scary at the time for him to know all that.
Yeah.
So
with that, he sent me back to the back of the room again. The next day we rode trucks, German Army trucks, to a prison camp. Stalag 12A was the name of it, just outside Limburg, Germany. We stayed there 3 weeks. There were several thousand prisoners in there. It was a large camp. We didn't get much food. I don't guess they had much food to give us. They had so many people there. But after 3 weeks, they had several thousand of us to line up down to railroad track at a railroad siding, where they had us to board boxcars. I know you've heard of the 48 boxcar.
yes.
That's what we were told to get on.
Can you describe that boxcar?
Well, the boxcars were built for 8 horses and 40 men. That was the size of them. There were 78 soldiers in the boxcar that I was in, and about the same number was in all of the boxcars. We were standing shoulder to shoulder. We didn't have bath facilities, didn't have any water, nothing to eat. We stood shoulder to shoulder, tight against each other. And as the boxcar started moving, if one guy moved, everybody moved. It was a most uncomfortable situation. Well, the train moved about 30 or 40 minutes that night once it started, and we heard bombers overhead, and we knew it was British bombers. You know, at that stage of the war, if you've been in the war a few months, you learn the sounds of the different companies' airplanes. I knew when it was British bombers, British fighters, or what have you.
What was unique about a British bomber?
The bombers started bombing and strafing the boxcars, this train. We felt sure they thought it was an ammunition train. There was an ammunition plant pretty close by this prison camp.
Were you on a train or in the camp with people you knew? Did you become friends?
Yes. The people that was in my squad that was captured, all of them but one, for some reason got sent to another camp. Only one of the guys were in Stalag 12A with me, and he was on this same boxcar I was on. But other than that, I didn't know the rest of them. But we rode that train. Anyway, let me get back to the bombing and strafing of it.
Sorry.
The bombers destroyed the railroad tracks. And by the way, this happened in a railroad yard. And from the noises, we knew we were in a railroad yard. And they were repairing the railroad yard and the train and getting a new locomotive. All they had to do took 6 days and nights for them to do that. The train did not move for 6 days and nights. And for 6 days and nights, we had no food, no water, no bath facilities, no nothing. And there were several dead in the boxcar that we were in. The strafing killed quite a few guys. One guy standing tight against me was hit with strafing right through the head. I just felt him sliding down. And he was dead. That was really the worst part of the entire war for me. Not only for me, for all the guys in these boxcars. Well, when the train started moving again after they finished with the repairs, it moved one day, and it stopped at another railroad yard, and that was outside Stalag 4B. And they opened the boxcars. Those of us who could still move around, they had us to unload the dead and stack them between pine trees. And it was at night. It was snowing. And it was cold, of course. And they had us to stand in the pine woods outside the camp the rest of the night. By the way, this was Christmas Eve night, 1944. I'll never forget Christmas Eve night. And the next morning, they had us to march inside the camp, where they gave us some German coffee, hard,
Sure.
like German bread, something to eat.
Was that your first food since 7 or 8 days?
That was the first we had in 7 days and nights, yes. And let me tell you, when you go without moisture in your mouth 6 or 7 days, it's tough. Thinking about it now, my mouth is getting real dry. But you get so dry, your throat swells, your tongue swells. You get to the point you can't talk. Let me pick up at this point. I stayed in this camp 10 days. And then they had a big assembly one day in a big room in this camp. And this German captain got up on a stool and said, I have 40 names to call. As I call your name, come stand by the sergeant. And the first name he called was Fred P. Dallas. What's he calling my name for? Well, there was a guy standing on my left, kind of in front of me, a little taller than me, a little bigger than I was. So I just stepped over behind the guy so the old captain couldn't see me. I thought if he couldn't see me, he wouldn't call my name again. He called it again and said, if I do it the third time, you'll be executed. So with that, I went up to the sergeant. Well, later in the afternoon, the 40 of us whose names they had called, they sent us into a separate compound in this camp, Stalag 4B, where we were given shots. And we were given the shots by Italian medics who were German prisoners then. They gave us shots in our chest. And when I saw what was going on, and I saw the length of the needle he was using, I thought, well, that's it. That needle is going to hit our heart. But they were smart. They knew what they were doing. All 40 of us were still living when they finished. So the next morning they put us on a passenger train, and we rode a passenger train that day till we got to a little town in East Germany named Rundorf. And just outside Rundorf they had a labor camp, small labor camp. It was built for 40 men. So we were put in this labor camp, and we stayed there until the 20th of April, the next April, just before the war ended. And the reason we left there then, our guards became real scared that the Russian army was going to get to them before the American army, and they knew the Russians were killing all SS troopers, and these were SS guys. So they took us out of the camp with their guns. They still had the guns. Had us walking, going west, actually southwest. At the end of the second day, we came to a little village called Rosenthal. And I thought it was in Czechoslovakia because I picked up a card in a store that had been destroyed, and it said Rosenthal, Czechoslovakia. So I thought we were in Czechoslovakia. I did until recent months. Anyway, we went in the school building, which was not in use, spent the night in the school building, and the next morning before daylight, terrible noise started outside, guns shooting, horses running. We went to the window and peeped out to see what was going on, and it was a Mongolian cavalry unit had arrived in the little village, and they were shooting everything that moved and just making an awful noise and killing people. So our German guard tried to give us their guns at that point. Of course, we wouldn't take the guns. We had them to stack them in the corner of a room furthest away from us. So if Mongolian came in the building or a Russian came in the building, when they got there, nobody would be close to those guns. So after daylight, a Russian infantry outfit came into the village. Well, one of our men, an American, who was a prisoner with us, last name was Kapelinski. He was Polish descent, and he could speak Polish fluently. We knew he could talk to the Russians. So we sent him outside to tell the Russians that we were in the building and that the guards were in there with us. So they sent Russian soldiers in the building, got the guards out, lined them up in the courtyard in front of a machine gun, and mowed them down. Right in
What
front
was
of us.
it like to see that?
Well, it was a terrible feeling. But one of the guards, I didn't mind seeing him shot. He was a mean fella, and he did his best to kill me 2 or 3 times. And another one of the guards, there was an older guy. He was a prisoner of war in England in World War I. We called him Pop because he was older. We thought he was an old man because he was 45. And anyway, Pop knew what it was like to be a prisoner, and he tried to protect us all he could without getting himself killed. And the guy that we called Whiskers, that was so mean, one of the jobs they had us doing, the first job they had us doing, by the way, was cutting up ice into blocks, maybe 50, 100-pound blocks. Didn't have any gloves, using ice picks and ice axes. Out there on this fish pond on the German farm, it was frozen to the bottom. They had us cutting that ice up and stacking it on a wagon, a horse-drawn wagon, hauling it into a little town named Horswerda, where they had a brewery. And the ice building was next door to the brewery. All the ice in there and stacked it in that building. And the walls were about 4 feet thick in this ice building. I guess they stored it for the summer use, I don't know. They never got to use it because Russian bombers destroyed the ice building later. Anyway, that was our first job. And if I had time, I could tell you about a lot more jobs.
Yeah.
But I just mentioned the last one we did. The last one we did was cleaning out open sewer ditches. This was after the ground had thawed, the ice had melted in April. And the sewer system in this town was open type ditches. And you had to stand in the sewer with those shovels to clean the stuff out. And Russian bombers came over the last day we were there, bombed the town, and we all had to lay down in the ditches real quick for protection from the flak. And we were so glad to do it to see old Whiskers laying in the sewer. Really. Well, the Russians destroyed about everything standing in that town, so they never got to use the facilities anymore. That was the last day we worked. The next day, the Russians had us.
Is that when you had to do your walk?
That's when we walked for 2 weeks going east, across East Germany and across Poland.
What was it like?
Felt tremendous And I came back to the States on a hospital ship as a litter patient. I stayed in an Army hospital in France about 6 weeks. I stayed in a coma 3 weeks, by the way. The next day after I got back with the American Army, I went out of it. And when I came to, I was in a hospital somewhere in France. I didn't know where I was. And the nurse said I'd been there 3 weeks in a coma. But I came back on the hospital ship in the last day of June. They took me in an ambulance from this Army hospital in the middle of France, took me in an ambulance to Le Havre, France, I believe was the name of the place, to a port. This big hospital ship was anchored there. I remember so well them rolling me onto this hospital ship. And
What did it look like, that scene at the hospital ship?
oh, it looked great to then. Yeah, it sure did. I celebrated my 21st birthday in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on that hospital ship. And I couldn't walk then. I didn't walk for 4 months. Doctors wouldn't let me try to walk.
But that's what got you home.
Well, the hospital ship went in port in Staten Island, New York, and they put me in an ambulance, took me to Harlem General Hospital of Staten Island, at that time a U.S. Army hospital. Stayed there 2 weeks, and they put me on a hospital train, sent me to Thomasville, Georgia, to Harlan, to Finney General Hospital in Thomasville, Georgia. And that's where they started letting me walk again. I learned how to walk again. And I was finally discharged from hospitals and from the Army on the 28th day of November, 1945. And that was in Daytona Beach, Florida, Welch Convalescent Hospital. Went home. And my health was real bad for a long time, but I made it. I guess the main thing I learned that my faith in God that I'd always had to some extent, I learned that was real important. That's the only reason I'm here today. I really believe that. I've learned over all these years, you must be honest, you must believe in God, and you must be friendly. Well, you must believe in your fellow man too.
What's your primary memory of your time at war? What do you really picture when you think back on it all?
I'll think back on it all. The main thing I think about, really, well, I think about the whole thing, but the thing that stands out in my mind so much is the POW days, really more than the combat days. Because there were so many of those days when you were at the mercy of somebody else, and that somebody else was trying to get rid of you. Once, well, let me back up a little. After I was discharged from the Army, first of all, I arrived home the next day. Within a week or two, I had a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I couldn't imagine, why am I getting a letter from the VA? I didn't apply for anything, but I did and didn't know it. The doctors, the last day I was there, had me to sign some papers in his office in Daytona Beach, Florida, in that Welch Convalescent Hospital. Well, I didn't know what I was signing. I would sign anything to get going. But what I had signed, one thing I had signed was an application for disability benefits. Because this letter I received from the VA informed me that I had been rated, according to that request, I'd been rated 50% disabled. And of course, I knew I was more than 50% disabled, but I didn't know I applied for anything. Well, this went on for a long time, and my health was bad. I finally got married, had my first baby, and then my health got worse. I had a job, was working. I really got to the point I couldn't talk for 3 months. Had strep throat. I never heard of strep throat before. But my throat got so bad I couldn't talk, and I was in sales. So in about 3 months I didn't have any income. And oddly enough, the VA started cutting my disability benefits at that time. Yeah. I didn't know why, but they did. Took me a long time to overcome that. And once I had overcome that, once I had obtained a decent disability income, I had done that by attending a seminar that a friend of mine invited me to attend down in Atlanta. He was teaching veterans how to file claims for disability. I thought I knew how, but I didn't. Well, as a result of this, I did a new claim to the VA for disability, and I wound up with 100%. And that's what I should have had all the time. As a result of that, I began thinking, and at that time I had been around to state conventions around the country as a POW organization, and had been around a lot of former POWs that were really disabled. And they were talking about the fact that they didn't have any benefits. So I became very concerned about that situation. I attended some more seminars, talked my wife into attending with me. We both became accredited as National Service Officers by the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington. I have the card in my pocket. We both became accredited. We both started doing claims all over the country. And it's the greatest feeling in the world when you prepare a claim for a man that's totally disabled and you know he is, and you know why, and you write that claim up like it should be written up, like the VA wants it, and he gets rated 100%. And especially if he gets a retroactive check, which a lot of them did. It's a real good feeling to know that you've helped the disabled guys receive their disability that they should have, and to know that they weren't going to get it otherwise. It's good to know you helped them get it.
Good. Good, that's good. I like that last part.
Yeah, that was nice.